Hi everyone, it's William. This will be part 11 of the long diary entry of 15th March 1921. This is the Grand Duke Dmitri diary series. My dogs are sleeping nearby and the Great Dane is sleeping a bit noisily. So if you hear that, I apologize for that. I'm kind of learning with these as I go along. So today I actually have at hand some dog toys that I can throw to distract the dogs if they start to get noisy. But right now they're sleeping, so that's good. Okay, so I got the book already that I mentioned that I'd ordered, The Russian Roots of Nazism by, what's his first name, Michael Kellogg. Very interesting book, cost me a small fortune, but it's updated. The other book I have is from 1965 or 66, and this one's from 2007. So views have been falling off a little bit, and I really hope that that's just because you're not necessarily interested in this aspect of Dmitri's life, rather than that I've managed to offend anyone. It may also be that I'm going a little too far afield with all of this, as far as I find the whole situation fascinating, and maybe my viewers do not. But it is an important part of what was going on in the White Russian emigration and what was going on with Dmitri. So my perspective as someone writing a novel about Dmitri is that it's absolutely crucial to be able to represent at the end of his life how he felt about everything, looking back, all of his political activities in before Russia with Rasputin, and then, or before the revolution with Rasputin, and then after the revolution in Europe for 2 decades, and whether in the end, as I've mentioned before, he gave up on the idea of being a consequential figure, someone who would help shape Russia's future, or whether he still was thinking about that. And I think he was still thinking about, to a certain extent. He'd been a fervent Russian nationalist, but then he told his sister in one of his letters that he had become a patriot of Europe. But at the other hand, he certainly never, ever gave up on Russia. He may have given up on his ability to have any influence there. And he actually rebuked his sister in the same letter for being anti-English. Dmitri had a real love-hate relationship with England, but at bottom, he was faithful to England, and he wanted his son to be educated there, and he made a special request to the British government when his son was born that they would allow his son to be a British citizen, whereas he was not, of course, and his wife was American. So that, yeah, he was not aligned with the Axis at all. But anyway, yeah, another thing that I just want to mention is, so for instance, this is rather a provocative title, isn't it? The Russian Roots of Nazism. Well, that's kind of been an ongoing battle amongst scholars as to whether in the early days, I think more in the early days, there was this idea that Nazism was something that came from a peculiarity of the German mindset, the German ethnicity, the German worldview, sort of sprung up in a vacuum in that sense. And then the other side, so there are writers like, I think it's Daniel Goldhagen, with Hitler's Willing Executioners, who have tried to make the case for that. And there are other writers who have gone pretty far in the other direction and said, well, no, it was other countries as well that bear the blame. And so the thesis on the other end of the spectrum is that it was the Bolshevik Revolution not that it was the fault of Russians per se, but that it was the Bolshevik Revolution that so shocked and horrified and terrified people that Nazism was simply a reaction to that. And you know, that's not without validity, I think, but you can go too far in that direction and say, aha, well, actually, the Russians were to blame with what developed for what developed in Germany, and that certainly isn't true either. So this book covers primarily a period between 1917 and 1923, when there was this sort of cross-germination between the right-wing Russian emigres in Berlin and Munich on the one hand, and the nascent fascist National Socialist movement in Germany. And, you know, it was relatively short-lived. There were then some of the Russian right-wingers who continued on with Nazism, but it, you know, as a real phenomenon, it was fairly short-lived, and so we're right in the middle of this process with Dmitri. And when it comes to ethnicity, you always have to remember that Russia was a multi-ethnic, multicultural empire, very, very much so. And so, you know, within the Bolshevism, some people like to say, aha, it was all Jews. Well, it wasn't. And within the right-wing end of the spectrum, also, it wasn't a single group or ethnicity. You had Russians, you had Ukrainians, you had Baltic Germans who were all involved in this. So, for instance, in this title of the book, The Russian Roots of Nazism, even if you believe that it was the Bolshevik Revolution that caused the Nazi reaction, we're not talking about an ethnicity. Okay, so here's the recap for the previous diary section. Dmitri met with Biskupski and told us that Biskupski claimed that Markov, too, and his group, his party, were willing to fall in line under Biskupski in return for financial backing, and that Biskupski, wanted to establish a so-called White International in opposition to the Red or the Communist International. And he told Dmitri that he had contacts everywhere and sufficient financial resources to make this happen. So Dmitri himself had mentioned the man's bad reputation and the fact that his name alone had been enough to make Dmitri have second thoughts about this guy, and he expresses skepticism about all of these things that Biskupski is saying and distrust for him, but, you know, there's a little bit of interest there. Okay, so for this particular section of the diary entry, our cast today is basically Biskupski, but also just the movement as a whole. Okay, so here we go. Of course, in France and England, Biskupski has a reputation as an ardent Germanophile, and that can be explained precisely by the fact that he, by his own account, is in personal contact with the Germans, the Hungarians, and the Bavarians, and wants to cast a line into Turkey. He personally treated me with great confidence, not hiding the fact that he saw me as the future leader. The extent to which all this is serious from a business or practical perspective, that, of course, is completely impossible to say. I left Berlin with a pretty good impression of the monarchists I met there. That is, only in the sense that they're actually thinking about doing something. But it doesn't follow that I, for a single instant, have changed my fundamental opinion, namely that the emigration will not create a new Russia or carry out a revolution, but that Russia will do it itself, spontaneously, and pull the emigration along with it. But it's undeniably a huge plus that the Berlin monarchists stand for a very broad program, which will most likely be more suitable for what will probably happen in Russia than the nonsense that the monarchists in Paris have been writing about. It is the breadth of their views, indeed, that gives the Berlin monarchists all their bigness. They will give broad rights to the whole population, civil rights and broad regional self-government. Okay, that's that. Oh, my friend. Boy, did they feed him a line. Okay, so one question I've been wanting to ask as I'm reading along with these is, what, if anything, did Dmitri know about Kirill's contact with these people? Because it was quite substantial. And Kirill, through his wife, was giving lots of money to this group Aufbau that was a combination of right-wing Russian emigres and German National Socialists. And yeah, did Dmitri know about any of this? Is that why he decided to stop in Berlin? Because he wanted to, because he knew that Kirill was sort of making inroads there towards becoming the emperor in exile? I just don't know. He does not mention Kirill at all in relation to any of this. But given that he had his little so-called information bureau, I would think it would be very unlikely that he didn't know that Kirill was trying to establish himself there as the future Tsar. Okay, so another question I have: did Dmitri understand that he was being auditioned for the role of Romanov, leader of the movement? Because he was being auditioned. He absolutely was being auditioned, and he actually failed that audition, thank heavens, which we'll talk about later. Graf, who was another, I don't think he was a member of Aufbau, but he was one of these relatively right-wing emigres in George Graf in Germany, and he would end up being the so-called chancellor of Kirill's organization. Well, he would talk about how Dmitri flunked that audition, and so I'm saving that for a little bit later. But anyway, whatever Dmitri knew about what was going on in relation to whether this was an audition or not, so to speak, it seems like they were just absolutely intent on deceiving him, because what he's describing is the polar opposite of what their program actually was. He wanted this preparation for the day when the spontaneous Russian uprising would occur without any intervention, especially any intervention from another country. And he wanted broad civil rights, he wanted decentralization. All of these will be platforms of the Young Russia movement. They want the equality of the various ethnicities in Russia. And yeah, so, it's just bizarre that these Biskupsky and Markov would present themselves to Dmitri that way. And I'll read that concluding paragraph again. It is the breadth of their views, indeed, that gives the Berlin monarchists all their bigness. They will give broad rights to the whole population, civil rights and broad regional self-government, and that is not at all what they had in mind. All right, so just briefly, I want to talk about another person who was almost Dmitri's counterpart, except that he was very much taken seriously and had done a lot, whereas Dmitri was, let's face it, he was important, but he was a peripheral figure. He wasn't out there fighting the fight the way Boris Savinkov was. So I've mentioned Savinkov before because he was the leader of the Socialist Revolutionaries terrorist organization, the Battle Group, way back in Imperial Russia, and was responsible for, although he himself didn't throw the bomb, he was responsible for the assassination of Grand Duke Sergei, Dmitri's uncle. But there's this weird parallel between Dmitri and Savinkov. So Savinkov had fought on the side of the White Russians against the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War. And then in exile, he was spending time in various places like Poland until I think the Soviets put pressure on countries like Poland and they would expel him. And he ended up in France, which was pretty impervious, I think, to the pressure from the Soviets. But one of the interesting things about Savinkov, and he's such a complex figure that I hate to talk about him for just a few minutes and simplify things. But one of the things that struck me about him is that he started his own, with the exact name that Dmitri gave his little intelligence organization, the Information Bureau. Savinkov also started his own information bureau. So that is interesting. And Savinkov, again, like Dmitri, Savinkov ended up meeting with Sidney Riley, the famed ace of spies, celebrated British espionage agent upon whom the character of James Bond was based. And Dmitri met with Sidney Riley in 1919, I believe. It might have been 1920, but I think it was 1919. And Savinkov met with him, I can't remember. Yeah, it was 1921, later in 1921, the fall of 1921. And so that's interesting, and you can see how intelligence agencies from the U.S. to Britain, to France, they were also sizing these guys up. And so, they were also auditioning for who they thought should be the horse that they backed in relation to the anti-Bolshevik movement. Okay, so the overall impression that I myself am taking a lot away from this is that there were lots of opportunists out there, and what they would have called back at that time adventurers, meaning not a person who was, going to go climb Mount Everest or something like that, but an adventurer, meaning a person who's purely an opportunist without strong convictions. So there were a lot of those, and Dmitri had in fact encountered some in Persia, as I remarked before. And on the other hand, you had the adventurers and you had the serious people like Savinkov and Milyukov, who nonetheless overestimated their own ability to influence things. And Dmitri could probably be included in that. At least he was trying to be serious about all of this. And he also ultimately a little bit overstepped his influence, but he would back off from that fairly quickly as far as thinking that he was going to be, as he puts it here, Biskupski is, what does Biskupski say? I don't want to miss the actual wording of that when Biskupski tells him, he's not hiding the fact that he saw me as the future leader. Well, that was a lie, of course, because Biskupski would end up going with Kirill, and Dmitri was just being auditioned. But anyway, it interests me that Dmitri has been so much forgotten in all of this. He's not mentioned in relation to the Sokolov investigation and the aftermath of the Sokolov investigation, even though he was one of the people that was really involved with that. And he's not mentioned in relation to the Young Russia Party that he was very, very much involved in. And he's not given a single mention in any of these books about the right-wing emigres. There's no acknowledgement that he had come to Berlin in 1921 and met with these people, whereas there is acknowledgement that Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich was a rival to a certain extent to Grand Duke Kirill. And so it's presented that the decision was between those two men, Nikolai or Kirill, and it was really much more between Dmitri and Kirill. So, you know, it's a little strange that he was so quickly forgotten that post-war historians just don't even mention him as a footnote by and large, and I think he would be very discouraged by that. So we'll try to redress that balance a little bit. Although really it's probably just as well that he's not mentioned in books like this Kellogg book. You know, even on the positive side of things, as somebody who went there and rejected it. But yeah, I will quit jabbering, and we will have Dmitri mentions this time leaving Berlin. He says that when he was leaving Berlin, he had this, I left Berlin with a pretty good impression. Okay, well, we still have a lot to go with Berlin. And, you know, we also have coming up some more about Marie-Louise. He will finish off this long diary entry talking about her. So, you know, if you're not finding this all that interesting, well, keep coming anyway. You know, put anything that has offended you aside, keep watching, and we'll get into more, you know, different territory relatively soon. All right, bye.